Okay, so when we talk about Dover Beach here, got to put a couple of things into perspective that may help our conversation. First, if you Google searched it and just hit the image button, what did you see? Absolutely. The cliffs of Dover are famous for their kind of white rock face and their very stark, the way it stands in stark relief. It's not a coastline that you can approach easily. It's got that sharp feature to it. If you Google searched it, you likely also saw a map pop up. Dover Beach is 22 miles from the coast of France. And so if you are near the coast, if you are able to see the cliffs on a clear night, likely you can see across to France. And of course, we're talking about the northern part of France here. A lot of times when we talk about England being close to France, first thought that a lot of students have is Normandy, storming the beach, D-Day. You got to think it's a lot further up, but the English Channel does separate them. So those visual pieces are really important. Matthew Arnold was not necessarily known as a poet. He was an inspector of sorts. He was a government official. He often wrote about politics, but within his lifetime also said, more and more mankind will discover that we have to turn to poetry to interpret life for us, to console us, to sustain us. Arnold wrote the poem in 1851 while he was on his honeymoon with his wife in Dover, and it was published by about 1867. The dates are important just in terms of making sure that we can put it into a cultural context. Arnold is reflecting on the world that exists in that mid-19th century ideal. Help me out a bit with your knowledge of world history and especially British history. What's going on mid-19th century?
Renaissance? Or like, I don't know.
Well, are you thinking like industrialization?
Isn't there like a war going on? Is it the Great War? Or is it?
Take a look and see. So the Renaissance tends to be earlier, like 16th century. Renaissance tends to be focused to like Italy.
But there, I feel like, I don't know, I heard in art class or something, there was like a second kind of.
Oh, the second Renaissance?
Yeah.
Okay. And a lot of that had to do with like some of the things that are being touched on here in the poem. Did you find your war? Like the Crimean War?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's Imperial Russia and United Kingdom, Great Britain. So it could be that.
It could be, but I'm going to tell you, we want to avoid thinking war because it's going to change our perspective of the end of the poem. And we'll discuss that. What is, a key thing that we see being discussed here in the poem that we're going to talk about in a second is religion. But as we start to move through the 19th century, especially mid-19th century, who's a figure that puts to writing some thoughts about science and perspectives that challenged religion?
Darwin.
Uh-huh. What did Darwin have to say?
The evolution and that there's natural selection.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Christian, so
Yes, you're correct.
he was worried about it would ruin the religion. So he talked about like natural selection and there's changes in species. It's not just what creationists believe.
Exactly. So Darwin brings up these ideas of natural selection. He challenges creationism. Yes, he was a Christian, but he did understand what this would do and how this would impact. And as we're moving through that 19th century, we do notice that science is challenging a lot of the beliefs of Christian doctrine. And it's starting to change some pieces. And so the date is important as we get into this context. One other piece we want to add before we lead into it is its structure. So this poem is an example of what we call lyric poetry. Now, this is a very wide open term. A lyric poem is simply a poem that is not narrative in structure, but instead tends to focus on a conveyance of emotion. Now, as you process that and you think about that definition, you're going, what poems have we read this year that actually are narrative and tell a story? Like, it seems like that's really limited, that most poems would then be lyric. That's why it's kind of a nebulous definition. And we're going to see why it's important here when we transition and we start to talk about prose meaning versus total meaning. When we look here, think about it this way. If you read the poem and you walk away going, this is more of an emotional response than it is a beginning, middle, and end, then yeah, we are likely looking at something that is a lyric in nature. And especially here, we're going to see why, because let's start to talk here. If I asked you to provide me a one-sentence summary of what happens in this poem, the literals, could you do it? What would you say?
Water crashes onto a shore, pebbles are taken out.
Yeah, water crashes on the shore and it talks about the pebbles. Okay. And the speaker watches it and he thinks, but is there anything else that really happens? So when we talk about prose meaning, if you're trying to look at like, how am I going to summarize this? It's why a lot of students have a hard time with this one, because they start to go, how am I supposed to talk about the pebbles? And we're going to get there in a second, because we're going to notice that the pebbles aren't really the important thing. It's almost a distractor. It's a way that we can get lost in this poem. Instead, we want to start to break this apart and go, hey, how does he develop meaning here? Before we get into breaking it down, I'm just going to open the floor. Anybody feel confident in what they're seeing as an approach to meaning? What do you think that Arnold is talking about here in this poem?
People losing faith.
People losing faith. I would absolutely agree with you there. Any other approaches that you kind of look at and you go, I think this is one of the major things he's talking about?
I think the line 3:3 pretty much sums it. Talking about how life is unrelenting. It's not joyous. It's not full of love. It's truly just like beating you down every day.
Yeah. Now, I will tell you that these two ideas go hand in hand. He does see that the loss of faith is what has kind of led us to this world that we see, where it does seem like a beatdown. It does seem like it is missing some of these pieces to it. Anything else before we start to break down kind of stanza by stanza to see how does he do this? All right, so let's start with stanza 1. Stanza 1 probably is the most tangible and literal of the whole poem. Would you agree? This is where we get your image of, the waves and the pebbles. If you had to pick a tone for this early stanza, if you were trying to give an idea, what are some words that would come to you? Calm. And notice it's right there in that first line. There definitely is a calmness to this, a serenity. If you've ever stood on the beach and had the opportunity to just watch the waves come in, there is that sense of just like, this is nice. Okay. So if we notice how we kind of move here, of course, we have that calmness in the first bit. And he introduces this idea of a full tide. Did you notice how he uses this to contrast later in the poem? So he has a full tide present in the literal. And as he moves into the figurative, he turns the sea into a literal thing into, if you notice, where you probably picked up that this is about a loss of faith, he's going to turn the sea into a sea of faith eventually. But notice what he has to say about the tide as he does that.
The tide, in the sea of faith stanza is like withdrawing and going back in.
It's withdrawing, it's ebbing, it's moving towards that lower tide. And so he's going to build this contrast using the tide as a literal versus a figurative. And we see that movement. So here we got to take note that tide is literal. And we can even move down here and go to stanza 3 right away and say the tide is figurative. And we can even say here the sea is literal and the sea is figurative. We have our definition in that first stanza where we get the bit, even if he didn't have the picture, he sets our stage. I am in England, France is over there. By the time we get to line 6, and he says, come to the window, sweet is the night air. Did you take note of the fact that that is an address to his beloved? This engages a major idea that we didn't quite get to. He is ruminating and thinking, but he is thinking aloud and he is talking and addressing his beloved with his thoughts on the world. It is important because of where he is going to go with this by the time we get into the 4th stanza. He starts to talk about what he sees. And again, he comes back to his address in line 9 by saying, listen, you hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease, and then again begin with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. A lot of people want to look at those pebbles and they want to go, oh, it must be a metaphor. The pebbles must be like people who are just thrown around in the waves. Art isn't. It's not. The pebbles just kind of help to make the noise. That's it. Don't get too far into this and think like, ooh, the pebble, it must be this. Don't go there. But the pebbles help to build just that sound imagery. Notice that we play with a lot of things in that first stanza that imagery-wise. We have our kind of sight imagery. We have our auditory imagery at play. All of these things play into that sense of calm. And that sense of calm gets challenged in the last line of the stanza and begins our shift because we go from calm to sad. And we make this turn. Stanza 2 begins with a note about Sophocles. Anybody remember his name? Greek, yes. Beginning of the year. Oedipus. Here we have a poet thinking back to another artist. We have a connection to logic and to intelligence. This is part of what's going to play into our time period thing. Because yeah, he's lamenting the loss of faith, but notice that what he comes to is not a quote from the Bible, is not a bit of spiritualism, but instead classic thought. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, again, a sea in his native land. And it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. And so by here, look at that shifting tone. Calm, sad, misery. We're now starting to bring it in, but as he's contemplating and thinking, as he's getting to his idea that we're going to introduce here in stanza 3 about the sea of faith, notice how he's slowly moving that tone before he introduces his main idea. He wants you there with him. He uses a pronoun in that same line with human misery about we. We find also in the sound of thought, hearing it by this distant northern shore. We is he and his beloved. As we think about this, we find also in the sound of thought. So as we hear the waves here in the modern sense in Dover, it may remind us of Sophocles, but we have that same idea. And by the fourth stanza, we get to it. The sea of faith, or the third stanza, my bad. The sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges, drear and naked shingles of the world. Here's your pebbles coming back. The pebbles are used in the first stanza to create the noise, the roar. It's there so that by the time we get to that third stanza, we can bring back our roar, that long, melancholy, withdrawing roar of retreat to the sea of faith. What we're getting is this contrast in his mind. Notice that our first stanza, we said it's calm. There's lots of imagery because we're presented with this physical beauty of the world. Everything's great. But we start to talk about, as we move into the fourth stanza too, and we've introduced it, this spiritual darkness that's present. And these contrasts come about as we look at things like the tone shifting, the wording becoming more serious. Now look at the beginning of the fourth stanza and look real quick at the first two lines there. Yeah, so we're back to his beloved. And would you put her into the physical beauty of the world or the spiritual darkness that's there? Oh, you took too long. You'd fail the test. This is like your significant other looking at you and going like, do you think I'm beautiful? We're thinking that long? Oh, you're in trouble. Ooh. It's like that bit. If she asks you, do I look fat in this? You got to pause just long enough. That way it seems like you're looking, but you know your answer is going to be no, not at all. You say it too fast, it's automatic. She doesn't think you're genuine. You actually look, you're in trouble. You got to figure out that perfect balance. So here, notice that he addresses it. She plays into this physical beauty of the world. Do you buy it though? Does this sound legit or does this sound desperate? Now remember, he's writing this poem on his honeymoon. So that's a trick there because you're going like, oh, then it's genuine. Probably is, don't get me wrong. But think about if you looked around and the world suddenly doesn't seem to make sense to you anymore. And your first response is to go, oh, love, let us be true to one another. It's almost as though they find themselves the only two people left. And it's like, well, I guess we better be true to each other because there's no one else available. There's no one else out there. This desperation is clear and it's strong and it's almost, gosh, it's frail. Usually love is presented in a really strong way, and instead here, it seems like it's the only thing that they have. In this loss of reason, in this loss of everything else that they have. I'm also going to ask you a second question here. Just scan the fourth stanza really quick before I ask it. So this is a poem seemingly about people in the world losing faith and a recognition of it. But what one word do you notice is not anywhere in this poem? There's no outward sign of religion. The one word that you would expect if we're talking about people losing faith and a response to it would be a plea to some kind of a supreme being, God, Lord, especially if they're British. It's going to be mired in Christianity. Think about, too, this is a man standing in Dover looking across the channel at France. He's looking, within eyeshot, he has the two most powerful countries in the world, arguably at the time. These two superpowers that also are centers of different faiths, both Christian. France is still heavily Catholic. England has, almost fully embraced the Church of England and that Protestant ideal. And so here he is at the center of it. He's lamenting the fact that the world is losing faith, but never once invokes the name of that supreme being in any way, shape, or form. And instead, look at what he instead turns to. Love. A human emotion that we all know, even though it's genuine and even though it can be strong, is also kind of susceptible to who we are as people. It can be fleeting. It can be momentary. It can be petty. And so notice here, where am I getting some of these ideas about it being kind of frail or like less than in this response, this desperation? It's from that. This is a poem not from a believer who is blaming the rest of the world for their lack of faith. Don't excuse that. Don't think that Arnold here is the chest-beating Christian going, oh my God, I live in a world of heathens. No one is as good as I. But instead, see it as this thinker. And it's why the Sophocles thing is so important. This is a guy who is intelligent, who can no longer accept the old stories and assumptions of faith that it's based on, because he instead has to see the constriction, the consolation. He sees like religion was a sense of, it used to give us certainty and it used to give us consolations. And those aren't possible anymore as we start to understand the world as it is. As science creeps in, as logic creeps in, as we start to question these things, the world is moving away from the certainty that faith used to produce. Let me give you an example. Years ago, I went to Rome, and one of the things that's really startling, of course, Rome is the center of the Catholic Church. I'm Catholic. One of the things that's really startling is you go into so many of these churches that are hundreds of years old, if not older than that. And they have on display these religious relics. So, for example, you go to one church and they have on display supposedly the chains that held St. Peter when he was imprisoned. They're sitting in this case, they're on full display. Now your brain is looking at that and going like, how do you know that that's actually the chain? That would mean that chain is like 2,000 years old. How do you know that's the chain that supposedly fell off that man's arms and he's a saint? Like, how do you verify that? And at the same time, your religious brain, your want for it kind of buys in. It wants that thing. It wants to believe in it. It wants that certainty of it. And you realize the purpose of the relic. The purpose of the relic isn't to ask the question and to kind of force that person to question it. It's instead to try to provide in a sense of religion where nothing is certain, a certainty. Here's something that is a tangible side of it in a world that there's nothing. But when you look at this, here's Arnold looking around his world. Does he have that relic? Does he have that thing? No. But what does he have? His what?
He has the waves.
He has the waves, but notice too, he has his beloved. And I think that's why when we look at that call at the beginning of the fourth stanza, it's so important that he turns to her. It's almost like there is nothing else that is certain in this world except for what we have. Do you see how these ideas are developing here? Let's end it by talking about what we get at the end of this poem. That's simile in the last few lines. Super important. Super, in a classical sense, this is like talked about plenty. We're here as on a darkening plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. Now, this is why I said, hey, don't get too focused on war, because students like to make this the literal part of the simile rather than the figurative part. And they want to assume that this poem is about strife, that in the understanding that the world is losing faith, that we have to fight. It's not what he's saying at all. What do you think he's saying instead? If we understand this to be the figurative part, what's he talking about?
Because there's no guiding force of religion in the population. They have people live their lives in a way where they don't understand the future, like the ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
And so, although armies clash by night, I think it's just talking about like how people clash with understanding the world around them.
Yeah. And I think when you look at that idea of clashing by night, they'd be clashing in darkness. Look at the beginning of the poem. Is the beginning of the poem dark?
There's a moon that's guiding you, but that's not it.
Well, but even when you look at it, the moon would illuminate. Remember, the cliffs of Dover are white. So even though it is night, there's a brightness to the beginning of this. Notice how it's in that idea of calm. We talked about how within the stanzas, we see that shift in tone. Notice how dark the tone is here. Forget just the night thing. Look at some of those other words in the last few lines that stand out to you. Pain, darkling, confused, struggle, flight, ignorant, clash. This is a poem that has a definite movement from a brightness to a darkness. And so you're right on with what you're saying about that ignorance. There's a meaninglessness that comes in by the end of this poem. That without this sea of faith, again, he's not trying to say that Christianity is the answer as much as he's trying to say that in the absence of this, notice that life seems to miss all of these ideas. That's what you were bringing up about that beatdown of existence. And that all we're left to do is kind of fight without purpose amongst all of us. This is a strong poem. It has a definite central message to it. It challenges its readers in a way, but notice that it comes back to being that lyrical expression. None of this is narrative in purpose. He's not trying to make an argument where by the end of it he presents a solution or an idea. Instead, this is his reflection as expressed to that beloved who's next to him on how he views the world. So let's